So we're jumping back into Genesis part 4 today, and the question to start us off with this morning: have you ever bargained with God about something? Have you ever gone and haggled with God about something personal or about something in your life? Lord, if you'll do this, Lord, I swear I'll build a church in your name, right? That's how Quaybog Church got started, Dean and Terry. But we can go to God and do that with a lot of things. It could be health things, ourselves, or family. It could be a job. When you're in school, it's like a test. Lord, please just let me pass this test. I didn't study. I don't deserve to pass the test. But Lord, if you just do this for me, I swear I won't cuss as much, right? There's or a boy or girlfriend. There's all these little things that we can kind of do this with. But again, sometimes it's heavier stuff. It's a job. It's the economy. It's a family sickness. It's personal sickness. It's, there's a lot that we can kind of go and we wrestle with God with. And I think there's real value in that. I do. I think there's real value in wrestling with him through difficult things. Brittany this morning, she started off with this verse with our call to worship. It comes from Philippians 4, and the words here are important. So let me read them now to you. This is what the Apostle Paul says from jail. So remember, this is Paul in jail. He says, "Don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition, with thanksgiving." So in prison, and then think about this today, right? So these words are pretty ancient words. These are 2,000-year-old words, but today there's a lot to worry about. People look at the upcoming election, people look at the economy, people look at what's happening overseas, people look at just how people are, how people feel, how we treat each other. It's yikes, the border, north and south. There's just pick something, right? Spin in a circle and then stop and point at something. You'll find something today to really be worried about. And he says, right in the midst of all that, in everything, through prayer and petition, he just says, look, this is what we should do. Present your requests to God. In the midst of that, God is going to meet you. And Amy did a great job just sharing your heart, and it's in the midst of all that stuff, can God meet us in those spaces? And today we're going to see Abraham really wrestle with this, the justice, the mercy of God, God's presence in the midst of difficulty. But when I speak as a Christian, because yes, I'm a pastor, but first and foremost, I'm a Christian. It's I know one of the values of being a Christian, of being called a child of God, is that I can go to God and I can present my requests. I can talk directly to him. There's so much in the New Testament that says because of what Jesus did, now I can talk to God. I don't have to go through somebody. I don't have to hope maybe God hears me. There's a guarantee that he will hear us. So we can present that to him without having to manipulate him, because we can't anyway. So last week, though, by just way of connection, we're going to be in Genesis 18 today, but I want you to see this wrestling with God that Abraham's going to do today, but it's part of a longer narrative that's been happening in the book of Genesis. So if you don't know the story of Abraham, he's the very first Jewish person, right? So Judaism is going to start with this guy, Abraham. Last week, what we saw in the build-up to what happens today is that God has been building trust in this guy, Abraham. And Abraham and his wife, Sarah, they keep failing, sometimes in spectacular fashion, right? Sinning and treating people in just terrible ways. And so in the build-up to what we're going to see today, there's been a lot of trust, though. There's been a lot of, this is who I am, Abraham. And so last week, we saw 3 really important things. Abraham had his name changed from Abram. So Abraham means father of many, and Sarah, his wife, also had her name changed. So Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. And Sarah means princess, right? Because there's going to be kings in her lineage. So there's going to be this change, fundamental change in them. And so they had to own, as they wrestled with the reality of this identity change, our names have been changed, and then Abraham had the added bonus of the sign of the covenant, circumcision. So if you don't know what that is, I talked about it last week. Well, don't look it up. I guess I'll just tell you. It's cutting off the foreskin off the penis of a male. And so they had to do this, he and his tribe, as adult men, right? And so this was a major change in their identity. But here's the thing. Abraham had to literally assume that identity. For the nation of Israel to start, Abraham had to become Abraham. He had to go and do the circumcision, not just on everybody else, but on himself. He had to own this identity and become the person that God said he was to be. Now, the difficulty for Christians is to do that every single day, because we can refuse that identity as Christians. we can look a lot like everybody else and not very much like Jesus. And the good and bad thing, it's a double-edged sword. Our culture today is seeing that. And in a lot of ways, they're calling us out on that. Sometimes unfairly, but sometimes fairly, right? They're looking at Christians and they're saying, well, this is what I think you are. So it's like, it's really, really important if you say you're a Christian to do this. Paul writing again from prison, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, he says, look, live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. You have received an incredibly high calling to represent Jesus Christ here on earth. And so that right there, just like Abram did last week when he changed into Abraham, we as Christians, if you are one today, you have to live a life worthy of the calling you received. People need to look at you and say, yeah, that person looks a lot like Jesus. Yeah, they mess up. Yeah, they do and say things maybe they shouldn't. But at the end of the day, man, that person's living a life worthy of the calling that they've received. Just like Abraham, we need to be able to do that. So that right there, that scene of him stepping into that is important because that's the call that's going to change everything. The call to be Abraham. And that's where we end up today. So here's all this trust that's been built. And now though, he's going to let and almost force Abraham to wrestle with him about God's grace, about his will, about his mercy, but then also about God's justice. This is a hard one for people. How do you fit God's grace into his justice? Right? Like that can be tough for anybody, but we're going to see God wrestle with Abram today. So wrestling with God. So I think to understand this scene, again, understand that God is doing something very unique in this chapter Genesis 8 or Genesis chapter 18. He's doing something very unique with Abraham. And so here is a very mysterious scene that opens it up because God is getting very personal and very real with Abraham and his wife Sarah. So starting off, verse 1. The Lord appeared. So this is Yahweh. In Hebrew, that L-O-R-D is Yahweh. So Yod-He, Vav-He. That's Yahweh is God's name. That's what he says. So the Lord appeared to Abraham, at the oaks of Mamre. Now that's just a little bit south of Jerusalem. So while this is all happening, while Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. So God is arriving to tell him something about this, what he's already said to him, his son Isaac, that's going to be born through Sarah. They still don't believe him. They're still struggling with this. So Abraham, and this is a very mysterious scene here, that there's like a lot of debate and a lot of talk about what's going on here. He looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed to the ground. So there's a couple of things to consider here. So first, we've already seen in verse 1 that it was the Lord that appeared to Abraham. Secondly, guys, especially old men, did not run in that world. You know, as a reminder, this is 4,000 years ago that Abraham lived. And so they don't do that. Much like the prodigal son in the New Testament, 2,000 years after this, the prodigal son comes home and his father goes out to meet him. And he does it by running to him. So this is a very awkward, embarrassing thing to do as a grown elderly man especially. And so Jesus is doing that to show the love that the Father has, the love that God has for his children, right? And so he goes after him by running. Much the same, Abraham goes and runs and meets them. So there's 3 men. A lot of people have asked, like, well, who are these 3 men? For thousands of years, people have been trying to figure out, who are these 3 people? Is it the Father? Is it the Son? Is it the Holy Spirit? Is it representative of that? Perhaps. But I think the most important thing to notice, though, is that one of these angels, one of these men, is referred to as Yahweh, and he speaks with the authority of Yahweh as if he is God himself. So this seems to be another appearance of God, because whenever this kind of stuff happens, he's trying to get us to understand something. He's saying something very personal and very real and very important. And Abraham bows to the ground in front of them, and he says, "My Lord, if I have found favor with you, please do not go on past your servant." So he wants to have this personal meal with them, because meals back then were really, really, really important. Even in a lot of cultures today still, tribal cultures particularly, meals are really, really important. To sit down and share a meal with somebody says something about your relationship. It's a very intimate thing to do. And so he says, don't go on without doing this. So if they say, okay, so then Abraham turns to Sarah and he says, hey, let's get some good meals, let's get a good meal together. I want you to get some milk, some cheese curds, some meat, and some bread. Now, if I'm in the heat of the day, I don't want cheese curds and milk, but back then, I guess they were okay with it. So that's what they bring in. This is a nice meal. They're going to share it together. Then as the meal is going on, we'll skip to verse 9, and God asks, where's your wife Sarah? "They're in the tent," he answered. And then the Lord said, again in Hebrew, Yahweh said, "I will certainly come back to you in about a year's time." So he just said this. So this is the second time. In the last chapter, he said this last week. "So I will come to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Repeating the promise, right? And by now it's 13 years old, right? They've been hearing the promise for a while now. But again, it's 13 years, right? It's really almost 25 years total. So this is difficult. It's a slow process here for this promise. But Sarah will have a son. Now, Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind him. So this is where the reality of the story hits home, especially if you are a mom or if you are a woman. So here she is, and just imagine, she's been hearing probably about this promise for a while, but now maybe for the first time, she gets to hear this spoken directly about a promise that's going to affect her specifically. And so she's sitting there, and then she's going to have to start to wrestle with reality a bit, because the Bible is just very honest about these things. What is being said right now is a miraculous thing. This is a hard to believe thing because the stage of the life that they're at. Right? We're talking about people that are way, way old. And so verse 11 here, we're talking 90 and 100 years old. So this is what it says. This is how the author describes these two. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. So again, early 90s, 100. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. She had passed the age of childbearing. So this is not something that is just it's not taken for granted. Because verse 12, she laughed to herself. And this is how she describes her and her husband. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight." They understand. I'm not exactly a spring chicken, and you're telling me that I'm going to have a child at my age. Now, Sarah lives to be 127 years old. So maybe if you're 90, that's not that old, but still, right? That's getting along pretty good in age. And so she does not believe this. So this is one of those times. This is like the Genesis 1:1, right? The creator of heaven and earth. The creator of heaven and earth is going to step in and say, I'm going to do something that doesn't make sense. This is going to have to be a miracle because you can't do this on your own. It is the ridiculousness of the scenario. They're fully aware that this can't actually happen. And then verse 13. But the Lord, Yahweh, again, he directly addresses Abraham. "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Can I really have a baby when I'm old?'" And then this is the central question to this whole entire promise to Abraham. In verse 14, is there anything impossible for the Lord? This is what this whole scenario, this whole scene, and the entire Bible rests on, is this question right here. And it's a good question for us to consider. Is anything impossible for the Lord? No, Abraham and Sarah, you can't do this on your own. You can't. You're going to need me to pull this off. And that word impossible right there, Old Testament written mostly in Hebrew, the Hebrew word there is pala, which is extraordinary, wonderful, or marvelous. So God is essentially saying, is there anything too extraordinary? Is there anything too wonderful? Is there anything too marvelous for me to be able to do? Again, if you're reading Genesis in the context of what it's supposed to be read, as if God himself is revealing something about himself to you all these years later, then what is he saying? It's answering that question. Is there anything too extraordinary, wonderful, or marvelous? No, you can't do this on your own. So he's addressing that awkward tension. So he goes on, God goes on, he says, there's anything too impossible for me. And at that appointed time, I'm going to come back to you. Third time he says this now to this couple. I'm going to come back to you, and in about a year, she will have a son. And then there's this awkward little exchange that happens at the end of this. And I reread this like a bunch of times, just trying to think, how awkward was this little scene that we see next? In verse 15, Sarah denied it. I did not laugh, she said, because she was afraid. But God himself says, no, you did laugh.
Well done.
It's like, can you imagine how awkward that would have been? Here's creator of the universe power, and Sarah's like, no, you got that wrong. I didn't laugh. And then his only response is, no, you did laugh. And I reread that, and I was like, because in the scripture, you don't get a lot of these like background details. How are people feeling? What are they thinking? What are they saying? And I'm just wondering, like, how awkward was that for Abraham and the other two angels that are standing there to have God just be like, no, you did. Well, they're just like, cool. Like, did everybody move away from Sarah? And I'm like, I think so. Because in the very next verse, you have this. The men got up from there and looked out over Sodom. It's like, yikes, Sarah, I'm going to let you handle that with God. I'm just going to go over here and look at Sodom. And so we have this almost hard shift. There's, again, remember, narrative storyline, right? Genesis is not just a bunch of random stories. There's a thread that's going through. I'm going to build trust in you, Sarah and Abraham. I'm showing you all these things. I'm making you these promises. I'm even covering you when you really screw up and you harm other people. I'm always showing up. Here I am. But now I'm going to shift not just from my will and trust, but now I'm going to shift into grace and mercy and justice. So I'm going to do something in you and Abraham that is unique and has never been done before. And so I really need you to understand and know me. I need you to actually wrestle with me a little bit on who I actually am. So there's this shift after all this stuff happens. God says, look, I'm going to do it. You guys are still having a hard time. So they get up. Scene changes. And God says in the intervening verses between this verse and verse 20, something that affects this next part. Next slide. And Abraham was walking with them to see them off. So now we have this shift to where he's going to bring Abraham in and he's going to let him know, okay, Abraham, this is who I am. This is what I'm really like. And you're about to see something, Abraham, that's going to be really intense. And it doesn't make sense to you. And it may even seem harsh. But I need you to understand something about me, about trust, about my grace, my mercy, and my justice. These are hard concepts. And so he's going to bring him in because he's going to essentially say in the intervening verses between this one and verse 20, he's like, I need this guy to teach his generations after him to do right and wrong. Like, I need them to understand that. And so I need Abraham to understand what I'm doing right now, what I'm about to do. So this is what God then says. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is immense, and their sin is extremely serious. So Sodom and Gomorrah, you may be familiar with those cities as ones, the fire and brimstone and all that, and God's judgment. And it's like, these are really heavy words, though. The outcry, immense, their sin is extremely serious. In Hebrew, these are really heavy words. And so the outcry, because a lot of people, they wonder, what did Sodom and Gomorrah actually do? Like, why was God so angry with them and upset with them exactly? Why the fire, the brimstone, and destroying these cities that still don't exist today? Like, what's going on? Well, the outcry, that word right there, outcry, is a Hebrew word. Again, Old Testament written in Hebrew, is ze'akah. That word, when it's used, means this. It's the anguished cry of the poor, the impoverished, or the oppressed victims of greedy exploitation. So when that word, ze'akah, is used, that is what's being talked about. So when God says, I've heard the outcry, it's of this stuff right here specifically. This stuff right here specifically. So what exactly were they guilty of? A lot of people think, well, it was sexual sin, certainly, because that's what we see in the next chapter is some pretty deviant sexual sin. And that is wrong. That is across the board. Yes, there is a right and wrong, and they were doing it wrong for sure. You'll see next week. But there was something deeper going on. There was something much, much bigger going on. And if you know the word sodomy and everything that goes with that of course is from Sodom, right? And it's from Genesis chapter 19. So that word is 4,000 years old, which is hard to wrap my mind around. And so what we see next week comes from that scene, but that's not really what they're known for. 1,500 years after what we're talking about right now, there's this guy, Ezekiel, a prophet. He comes along. And so think about that. For 1,500 years, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be told. And when they look back 1,500 years later, what is the issue in God's eyes when he says, this is why they got destroyed. This is why they were so bad. What was that? If it wasn't really sexual sin. So this is what Ezekiel says. Looking back 1,500 years, he says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. So sister, he's talking to the people of Israel, or more specifically, the nation of Judah, and he's saying, look, this is your sister. You are just like Sodom. She, next verse, she and her daughters had a few things. They had pride, they had plenty of food, and they had comfortable security. So they had everything that they needed, but everything that they needed made them prideful. So this right here, this idea right here, why it's important to slow down and think about this is this sin right here hits much closer to home for most people. Now, like I said, sexual sin is still an issue and a big problem in America. But what's really an issue, what needs to hit harder to us that usually doesn't? What is it that we dismiss? Well, it's this issue of having everything that we need, and that everything that we need is making us prideful. It's making us lazy. And then lastly here, the issue, the point that God makes is that they did not support the poor and needy. That right there is a huge issue for God. If you begin to read your Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, this comes up over and over and over again. The problem is that today we call this social justice, and we make this a political issue that particularly people on the left, they're just about social justice, and they just want to give handouts, and they just want to do that, and they just want to do it. It's like, and all of a sudden it's like, well, what if I'm on different ends of the political spectrum? Can I do, if I'm a Christian, how do my politics and it's like, and I hear people struggling with this. I hear Christians really wrestling with this, and I hear Christians arguing over this, and it's a political football, especially now we're in an election year. But for God, this is a huge issue. This is not, if you want to say today you're a Christian, this is not optional. This is the bottom rung of the ladder. This is basic care. This is love others as you love yourself. This is love people and reflect God's love and generosity and mercy with you. So don't let your politics lead. Don't let your judgments lead. When I drive by a person and they've got the sign up, man, my first response is not, well, man, I want to be like Jesus. It's like, oh, I wonder what this person did wrong. I wonder what they're going to spend this money on. It is. Almost every time I have to fight that, like, oh yeah, I wonder what they did. They're just going to take this and they're going to do X, Y, and Z. And so it's like those kinds of things are the things, judgments, prejudices, like, oh yeah, they're from that part of town, or they're from there, and that's probably, they're immigrants, oh, they're here illegally. And it's like on and on and on. And this is not easy. I'm not standing here to say, oh, it's super black and white, easy. It's this or this. We live in a very complex world, in a very complex economy and democracy and time in history. I understand that, and I appreciate that, but there are far too many people that have everything they need and couldn't care less about people that are suffering. This is a big issue for God. So historically speaking, when historians look back on the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and they see historically what they were doing right and wrong, there was a problem, a heinous moral and social corruption, an arrogant disregard of basic human rights, a cynical insensitivity to the sufferings of others. Man, I can fall into that one right there. A cynical insensitivity to the sufferings of others. This is your pastor, right? Like, this is something that I have to be aware of when I see people, when I hear stories, when people call the church, when people walk into our church and they start giving me a story about how rough their life is and how much in need they are. My first response often is to think like, yeah, I've heard this story 1,000 times with 1,000 different variations from 1,000 different people. And I know you're lying. Because people do. They make their rounds to churches in the area and they forget their stories. They forget how many kids they're supposed to have, or what diseases the kids have, or what mom is sick from. And they come back around and we're like, oh, didn't you have 3 kids? Oh, right, well, one moved out, or no, yeah, one. And they can't remember the stories. And I can get cynical, and I can become insensitive to the sufferings of others. So we've had people come in, and I have to say, Lord, let me have a heart like yours. Let me have a heart like yours, Lord. Let me actually hear this person out. And if they're trying to take advantage of us, then I'm going to call them out on it, because I'm okay with that. But at the same time, Lord, help me have a soft heart. Help me have a soft heart, Jesus, because I've got everything I need and more. So this is the issue of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is the condemnation that's given, and I don't want that to be said of us. Because I want you to think right now, if God rolled up in this room as the angel of the Lord, and here he is standing here, and he says, all right, I need you to present evidence that you're not like this, that you are not like Sodom and Gomorrah, what would you say? I don't know, Lord, I have a soft heart for people that are poor and needy, and this is just some of the stuff I've done. It's not, I'm not building buildings, I'm not out there buying cars, I'm not, but what am I doing? What are you doing, if you're a Christian, to reflect the heart that God has for the poor and needy? Right? This is the issue, and God is trying to get him to see this. Abraham, this is an important issue. This will be a big focus in the law that will eventually be given to Israel, the poor and needy. So I need you to understand the outcry of these people is a big deal for me, all right? So then we jump back into the passage. And he says, I will go down to see if what they've done justifies the cry that has come up to me. If not, I'm going to find out. God doesn't actually have to go down. It's not like he doesn't know. He's saying to Abraham, I want you to know that I am a just God. Because Abraham, what is about to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah is going to make you think, what in the world is going on? Oh my goodness gracious, what just happened to those cities? God's like, I want you to understand who I am, my grace, mercy, and my justice, and how they fit together. So we're going to see this, this intense scene unfold, because now things get underway. Verse 22. So the men turned from there. So two of them, we're going to see what they do tomorrow, or next Sunday. They turned from there and they went towards Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. So now he's going to wrestle with God now. Because, again, if you're not putting the details together, Abraham has already gone off, chapter 14, and he's fought for some of these people. When his son, or his nephew Lot, was kidnapped, Abraham chased after him, and he went to war for the people of Sodom, and he went to war for his nephew Lot. So he has fought for these people. Some of his own people have probably bled and died for some, well, not died, but bled for these people because he went after them. So he's wrestling with God's justice and mercy because he's like, I know some of these families. I know some of these men and women and their kids. I know, God, and my nephew is there. So they're going to go down and they're going to do this, and it's and here now Abraham is going to wrestle with God because he's going to fight for them, but he's also just as boldly going to pray for them. Because Abraham's I know you're going to do what you're going to do, but is it going to be just? And everything leads up to now. Everything God's been doing in him leads now to this little conversation that is unique in Scripture. Nobody else really gets to do this kind of an exchange with God, but I believe God is allowing him to wrestle with him. Instead of just being all right, Abraham, stop. He lets him have this back and forth rhythm. Not so much bargaining, but just wrestling with God. So verse 23, Abraham stepped forward and he says, will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? It's God, are you just? What if there's 50 righteous people in the city? Will you sweep it away instead of sparing the place for the sake of 50 righteous people who are in it? He's you could see him as is he pacing around at this point? It's you could not possibly do such a thing. To kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. You could not possibly do that. And then this is a unique title, phrase used of God. Won't the judge of the whole earth do what is just? The judge of the whole earth. Won't you do what's just? Then verse 26, the Lord said, look, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I'll spare the whole place for their sake. Now we have the back and forth. Then Abraham answered, since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, even though I am dust and ashes, suppose the 50 righteous lack 5. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And then just so simply, God just keeps saying, it's just so simple. I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Then again, he's pacing around, he's nervous because the reputation of Sodom is pretty clear. So he knows what's going on in that city. And so now he's thinking okay, there's probably not 50 people there. I know these people. What about 45, God? So now he's going to have to start again. Now he's going to have to go back and forth. Then he spoke to him again. Suppose 40 are found there. God answered, I will not do it on account of 40. Then Abraham says, let my Lord not be angry. Now he realizes he's kind of pushing it, right? Creator of the universe and everything. He says, let my Lord not be angry, and I'll speak further. Suppose 30 are found there. God answered, I'll not do it if I find 30 there. Then he said, since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, suppose 20, just 20, Lord, are there. God replies, I'll not destroy it on account of 20. Then he said, let my Lord not be angry, and I will speak just one more time. Suppose 10 are found there. And he answered, I will not destroy it on account of 10. And when the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he departed, and Abraham returned to his place. So what was he trying to do there? What's Abraham trying to accomplish in this little exchange between verse 23 and 33? I mean, he's interceding, certainly, for his nephew Lot and his family, right? Like, this is my family. But he's also wrestling, and God is allowing him to and almost calling him into it. He's wrestling with how does your mercy and your justice fit together? Like, I don't understand, God. I can't wrap my head around what you're going to do to these cities. What is going to happen to these people, Lord? How can you be a just God? And so God allows him to wrestle with this. And it's like, and as Abraham goes on, because the numbers are going down, you can see Abraham knows, like, man, things have gotten completely out of control in these cities. And the way that they are taking advantage of people and harming people and just crushing those that are poor and needy. Like, I know what's going on down there, and that's why the numbers keep getting lower and lower and lower, because he doesn't have a lot of confidence in the reputation that they have. And so God allows him to wrestle with that. He allows him that struggle, and he stops at 10 because it's like he just understands, like, he's not going to destroy innocent people. Like, this is a place Abraham knows and understands. Again, he knows these people, and he's like, yeah, like, I know what's going on there. And then he's going to be worrying. He's like, well, what about my nephew? Right? He's never going to let that go. And you see that in the next chapter. But what I think is fascinating about this little closing of this chapter and how everything led up to it, it's like after Abraham wrestles with God, it's like he finally trusts the judge of the whole earth. The conversation ends there, and he's like, okay, like, this justice, this judgment of these cities is not going to be kind or easy. And it's like, and so as I read all this and as I thought about this, I mentioned to you last Sunday that it was 6 p.m. Saturday night, and I was still trying to figure out what God was saying. This week, God made me wait till about 7:05 a.m. When Pastor Tim came in. He's like, hey, how you doing? You all set? And I was like, just about 2 minutes ago. So at 7:04 a.m., I was like, I just still wasn't hearing clearly. Like, I had all this stuff, and I was done, but it was like, well, what's the bottom line, God? Like, what are you showing us out of all of this? And so as I prayed and as I thought, and I just sat and, like, thought about everything that was happening and what had happened to Abraham and Sarah, it's this right here. And this is a theme you're going to see again in the near future with one of his grandkids. If you truly do want to understand God, what do you need to do with him? You need to wrestle with him a little bit. You need to ask hard questions. You need to talk to other people about your doubts and your fears about him and justice and mercy and about, like, God, I don't understand. How am I supposed to care for people when I feel like they're just going to take advantage of the system or they're going to take advantage of me? I don't stand up here trying to give you easy answers. Like I said, this is very complex, but what matters to people is much different than what matters to God, right? People matter to God. What matters to people? Usually stuff, status, right? Things that really don't matter that much. It's like, so God's like, I need you to realign your heart so that you love me and that you love other people, right? That those two relationships are right. And it's like, living that out is super hard. But God says, look, the bare minimum, I need you to know certain things. And I expect certain things of you, people, and especially if you're a follower of mine. I expect certain things of you, because the world desperately needs it. So if you want to truly understand his will, you pray with him. You talk with others about your questions. You read scripture, and you get to know God's heart. You get to see, man, God, his justice looks really harsh sometimes, but man, his grace and his mercy are always there. Somebody just the other day asked me, like, man, I don't know how do I tie the Old Testament God and, like, with New Testament Jesus? And Jesus is all about love, but man, God of the Old Testament, he seems pretty harsh. And it's like, do you know on average, when you see God's justice, when you see a divine act of justice in the Old Testament, it's usually after 400 years of him being like, hey, stop doing that. Hey, stop doing that. Hey, stop doing that. You need to stop abusing people and hurting people and murdering children. You need to stop doing all this stuff. Like, this is not okay. 400 years of that, generally speaking, on average, will go by. And then all of a sudden it's like, wow, that seemed really harsh. Why'd God do that? Well, because 400 years he's been saying, hey, stop. You know what I'm saying? So then you get to the New Testament and you're like, okay, so Jesus is God. Jesus is still patient, but Jesus is still loving, but Jesus is also holy. Jesus isn't my buddy and my co-pilot. He's not there for advice. Jesus is God, and he's the Lord of my life. That's what it means to be a Christian. So, like, I'm going to realign my life. As difficult as it is today, I'm going to realign my life around him. I'm going to wrestle with him. But here's the good news. Here's the cool thing. Here's what we get to do. Philippians 4:6. I'm going to end where we started. The opportunity that we have is a direct one. That's what New Testament reveals about our relationship with God because of what Christ did. You don't have to go through me to get to God. because that's exhausting. Anyway, I would never want to do that. To be your gateway for God? No. I'm just a guide, right? I'm a guide. I'm just a leader in the process. That's all. But here's the access that we have to God. Again, as a reminder, writing from prison, Paul says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. And then simply put, out of the NLT, tell God what you need and thank him for all he's done. The result of that, then you're going to experience God's peace. And that's going to exceed anything that we can understand. And lastly, his peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ. You have to live this stuff out, right? We can't just do this on Sundays and in our own personal quiet time. You got to do this at work where it's difficult. You got to do this where you have a coworker who always, you know what I'm talking about? Or when you're a kid in school and you do all the work and the project and then they do nothing and then they get a good grade. Or you do a project at work and then they just want to jump on the coattails and then they get credit for it. Or a boss gets the credit for something that you did. It's that's the difficult places where we have to live our faith out. You got people in your life that are abusive and toxic and and harmful. It's Paul's in prison and he's getting ready to lose his life for his faith. It's again, like Amy said, man, Jesus is going to meet you in those difficult places and he wants you to wrestle with him in those difficult places. Because like I said, if you truly want to understand God, wrestle with him. I love that God doesn't say, I don't want your problems, I don't want your doubts, I don't want your fears. He says, give them to me. Let's wrestle through it. Let's grow your faith. That's the invitation that we have from God, and it's a powerful thing because it changes everything. It changes your life, and it certainly changed the life of Abraham and Sarah when they walked through this stuff. Just wonderfully powerful and beautiful lessons that we have from these people that were imperfect and lived 4,000 years ago. Man, I'll tell you what. So let me pray on that. Lord, I thank you very much for today, and I thank you for these people. God, you speak through their stories. God, you speak to us about what you expect of us. Just as a baseline for human beings, God, how we should care for one another, but particularly those that belong to you. I pray, God, that we'd be worthy of that calling that we have received to represent you here, your justice, your mercy, your love, your care. Help us to do that in a really complex world, a really divided world with not a lot of easy answers, Jesus. I pray specifically for those here, those listening, those watching, that, God, you're going to show us how to do this. I pray that in your name, Jesus Christ. And his church said, Amen. It was great seeing you all today. God bless you this week.